We start at an RAF airbase in Scotland, as a commercial jet is guided into landing by the Bermuda military, and they're soon under the impression that it's been hijacked because a brown fella appears in the cockpit talking about explosives being on board. Meanwhile, a traumatised little boy is rescued from the cargo hold holding a little teddy. Commander Drummond reckons that said brown fella must be holding the passengers hostage because no fucker is getting off the plane, so tells his German-speaking colleague to get off her ass and go ask that little scrote they just rescued what the bloody frig is going on already. So then we do a flashback to the previous night, as a baldy kraut called Nadia slaps on a wig, cause she seems to be suffering from leukemia rather than just being an REM superfan, and bizarrely sends her prepubescent son Elias to check them in at the airport. And there, that alleged brown terrorist fella from earlier helps little Elias with his bags. Whilst back in the hotel room, his mum talks to her doctor in New York about her forthcoming medical treatment when she lands. Anyway, once night falls, she heads off to the airport and meets up with her young slavey son, what she seems to make do everything for her, and then pops into the box to do some sweet drugs and shit.
Nice.
Although this must be a bad batch, because she convulses worse than my aunt after a 7th booster shot. Meanwhile, Elias gets chatting to the brown geezer again, what looks a bit like an Arabian Javier Bardem if you squint from the right angle, and he says his name is Farid. Once on board the plane, we meet some of the crew and passengers, including the newly recruited first officer, a misogynist stockbroker from Scotland, and another newly recruited camp male flight attendant was totally a walking stereotype. Anyway, once in the air, turns out Nadja's a nervous flyer, so she decides to look at some family photos and take a little comfort in a flashback. Mainly to a day where her husband pelted her with snowballs whilst holding a newborn son.
Sounds dangerous.
It is. Very dangerous.
But turns out they totally broke down on the way home, and said hubby twat, what loves lobbing snowballs at his own family, heads off to seek some assistance, because he clearly can't do basic motor repairs for shit. Back on the plane, the misogynist stockbroking Scott moans about the Wi-Fi going down, so now he can't even get onto Pornhub either. But the stewardess just says, well, what do you expect, mate? We're flying over the middle of the Atlantic, son, so shut up about it already. But suddenly, a commotion kicks off, and the cabin crew take a drunk passenger behind the curtain, before an undercover flight marshal arrives, who quickly gets carved up like a common hog. 'Cause turns out they're all in on it together, and are totally a bunch of naughty hijackers and stuff.
No way!
And this newly recruited camp male flight attendant is totally a raging psychopath what even the other terrorists are shit scared of, and promptly tells everyone that his name is 8-Ball, and also to sit down and shut up, whilst the others are let into the cockpit. 'Cause of a shocking twist, what no one could ever see coming. Turns out the newly recruited first officer was also in on it all along, and he's only gone and killed the main pilot as well.
Oh dear. Oh dear, oh dear.
Elsewhere, one of the terrorists uses a UV light to find a secret message on the floor, whilst a terrorist leader called Berg, who looks like he could have been involved in a prison break in a previous life, informs the passengers that he sure hopes they like tea in Downton Abbey because they're all getting a free trip to London now they've totally rerouted the plane. Naturally, Nadja's shitting herself, because she specifically chose this flight so she could land in New York before sunrise because reasons. So little Elias tries to run to the cargo hatch so they can totally hide, also because reasons. But that crazy 8-Ball fella catches them in the act and totally shoots up his baldy mum with a terrible wig, before Berg bollocks the crazy cat male flight attendant and tells him that shooting up unarmed women in a pressurised tube 30,000 feet in the air just ain't fucking on, son. Anyway, as her life flashes before her eyes, we continue with that random flashback from earlier, as Nadja goes off looking for a misogynist husband or preferred studying how to throw a snowball rather than how to fix a car engine, and she quickly comes across an abandoned cabin in the woods and promptly heads down to the basement. And before you can say, this'll end well, she's attacked by a vicious snarling creature with no self-awareness. No, not Meghan Markle. And she soon ends up locked in the cellar where she finds the body of her useless hubby, before the creature attacks her from the side window and starts munching on her fingers and shit. But luckily, the morning sun totally comes to her rescue and seems to burn the creature away, but not before she's totally infected with vampirism, and presumably also full-blown AIDS and rabies.
Sucks to be you.
Anyway, back on the plane, she regains consciousness and escapes down into the cargo hold, Whilst back up top, the baddies get a brownie to read a pre-prepared terrorist confession letter in Arabic, given they totally tried to frame him as a naughty hijacker. After she then munches up a poor innocent doggy and then a baldy baddie for good measure, the phony fakey Javier Bardem looking fella goes and comforts little Elias, who's crying in his seat like a riot yak. Nadia then does some more drugs to keep her condition at bay, because if she don't take the medicine every few hours, she'll go more feral than a bunch of libtards on TikTok after the naughty orange man won re-election.
Correct.
Making her way back up to the cabin, and now looking like a cross between Lady Gaga and that creepy goth bird from The Ring, she overhears the baddies preparing to escape the plane, but they soon find the body of their mate with half his neck ripped out, and hilariously just assume it must have been an escaped dog what tore their chum to pieces off screen.
Okay.
Anyway, Elias and his vampy mum totally reunite, and soon discover there's no fucker flying the plane. Naturally, the passengers shit themselves when they hear the news, especially when the only one left who vaguely knows how to fly is a scrawny soy boy who can barely speak English.
Oh shit, not good.
The misogynist stock trading Scott then reveals that the financial markets have been rigged, and the naughty hijackers stand to make billions if another 9/11 style attack happens and they can manage to short the market. And Fareed finally realises that he's going to be framed as a terrorist, given they made him specifically record that pre-prepared Arabic confession letter.
No!
But before said naughty hijackers can enact their escape plan though, the scrawny soy boy turns off the autopilot and takes them off course. So now their cunning plan is all ruined and shit. And worse, 8-Ball realises that the unarmed woman he shot up earlier is somehow still alive. So they all march up to the cockpit to find out what's going on. Now locked out and all their well-planned plans spunked up the wall, Berg starts shooting some passengers to get our heroes to open the door. And it's only when they threaten a poor little ginger does the undead woman flip out and go for some baldy-on-baldy action. And pretty soon all hell breaks loose, as bullets and fangs fly around the cabin and poor Berg is left out here casually transforming into a vampy fella. And he's also shitting himself, because the last time he did that, he ended up in a terrible Blade sequel. So he don't really want to go back to being a piss-poor Dracula wannabe what totally tanked his career.
No! God! No!
Luckily, Nadia finishes him off before he can transform, and then tells her prepubescent son to totally stay inside the locked cockpit with that random scrawny soy boy stranger guy. Elsewhere, 8-Ball quickly works out that she's a vampire, like from that Buffy show he used to watch back in the day. Whilst Nadia takes her last batch of drugs and again does a flashback, this time to when she returned to that dodgy cabin in the woods where she got herself munched up, because now she's totally looking for answers and stuff. She then runs into an elderly vampire fella who says coming into my property and killing my mentally ill son, what has a rare medical condition, just ain't fucking on, son. And before she can ask him how he controls his supernatural homicidal disorder, he tries to blow her away with a shotgun after accusing her of spreading the evil what they themselves just spread to her. So naturally, she smashes his face in and robs all of his medicine.
What a fucking liberty!
Later, the baddies return to the upper cabin, and 8-Ball uses that UV light from earlier to burn Nadia's skin, and then extracts a vial of her blood for shits and giggles. But little Elias saves his baldy mum by shooting out a window, which also has the unfortunate side effect of incapacitating the scrawny soy boy pilot, and thereby allowing the thugs control of the cockpit. And they soon put the plane back on a collision course with London, as a trolley then slams into that Scottish stockbroker and soon squashing him flatter than Prince Elrond's face. Anyway, Nadia dumps her little scrote onto budget Javier Bardem and races down to the cargo hold, where 8-Ball has locked himself inside a bulletproof car and then injects himself with her infected blood, which also causes him to convulse worse than Michael J. Fox on shrooms. So she then sets him on fire, which reminds her of that time when she killed the other elderly vampire and then set his gaff alight too.
So good for you, girl! Go on!
Unfortunately, this fire is put out remotely, and a crispy fried yet still very much alive 8-Ball promptly munches up the rest of his crew. Now losing control herself, Nadia escapes and almost munches up her Arabian bum buddy who's lining up to be a potential father figure to her young son, but retains just enough self-awareness to temporarily stop doing all these bad things and tries to lock the other vamps down in the cargo hold. Unfortunately, said Arabian bum buddy comes over to help secure the door, but immediately gets himself bitten, and it looks like it's curtains for the poor Muslim fella now on board a hijacked plane, who what for once has nothing to do with him or his religion. But luckily, Naja has seen all 11 seasons of The Walking Dead, and so promptly cuts off his hand to prevent the infection from spreading. Huzzah! She then captures the naughty first officer and tells him to turn the plane back to New York already, because she needs to get to a medical appointment in the morning.
She needs to sort out her priorities.
But said naughty first officer tells her that they ain't got the fuel for that, so instead contacts the nearby Scottish military base and requests an emergency landing. But suddenly, the vampire fellas burst through the door and start feasting on all the passengers. Nadja soon realises that they can't really land the plane when it's full of feral monsters, what will just spread the infection around the world and doom the entire species. So Farid comes up with a plan to rig the place to explode just after they land, whilst the vamps are off hiding in the cargo hold from the sun and shit. But in order to do it remotely, they need the remote. But the remote is on the corpse of a hijacker back in the hold, and none of them can fit through the small maintenance tunnel that's the only way back there without going through the horde of the undead and getting themselves munched up. So Nadja volunteers to do one of them self-sacrifice things, but Elias says sod that and jumps down the tunnel himself, using the handy UV light he picked up earlier to fend off the army of killer monsters. And although he retrieves the detonation device, he soon gets overwhelmed and has to hide under a small car like a frightened pussy. So naturally, his mum tells Farid to look after her precious son and then gobbles up the first officer, using him as some sort of sugar-boosting walking candy bar what supercharges her strength, and allows her to make it through the halls of enemies, where she then faces off with her arch-nemesis 8-Ball to totally save her sprog. And after she gets smacked up like a little bitch, Elias returns a favour by blowing the baddie out the door and burning him up real good and proper. He then cuts his hand and pours his blood into the ravenous maw of his monstrous mummy. And now being barely able to fight the evil inside, she uses the last remnants of human cognizance to push him away and run off into the darkness. And before you can say, okay, but how is he not frozen to death by now? We cut back to the present, where Elias promptly warns everyone about the current situation on board. But no one quite believes that a pack of feral vampires are hiding out in the back of a jumbo jet, and it's much more likely that the brown bloke in the cockpit, what's also a practicing Muslim, is actually a naughty terrorist fella what's holding everyone hostage. So the military goons hilariously spend the whole day demanding that the one armed guy trapped in said cockpit totally surrender and walk out with his hands up.
Bruh.
And as dusk falls, Farid makes a last minute run to the makeshift bomb so he can blow them all up manually. But Drummond's men soon board the ship and capture him before he can do a self-sacrifice thing, and they then get themselves massacred and shit. Waking up from sedation, Elias cries for his little bear, and then jumps out of the back of a moving vehicle like he's in some sort of budget Fast and Furious movie, before running off back toward the plane. Elias spots his bawdy mummy, who used to fucking love a bit of REM, but who has now not only lost her religion but also her humanity, and no longer sees Elias as her beloved little son no more, but instead a rather tasty chicken McNugget. So he pulls a remote out of a teddy's arse and blows them all to Kingdom Come. Farid then runs over to see if he's okay, and the stubborn military commander, who's now got a rather lot of egg on his face and presumably a whole mess of paperwork on his hands, hilariously tells his men to uncuff the one-armed bloke while they somehow restrained behind his back. And we end on the last two survivors embracing warmly in the middle of literal scorched earth. And that's it. That's the movie. And man, this flick was so relatable. I mean, who hasn't visited a remote cabin in the woods, got blown off by a local loony, and then done a bunch of drugs in an airport bog? 'Cause that's practically how I spent every weekend in the 90s, son. But anyway, that's the plot and that's your lot. Considering that bell thing so you don't miss any future recaps. Tell me if you liked this flick in the comments, if you have time. And I'll blow up some baldy vampires with you in the next one.